Stand at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin today, and you'll find a tourist attraction. People pose for photographs, buy fridge magnets, eat currywurst from a stand 20 feet from where soldiers once had orders to shoot. But stand in this exact spot 60 years ago, and you're at the most dangerous border crossing on Earth. One side, freedom. The other, a wall, searchlights, guard dogs, and a government that would kill you for trying to leave. Now zoom out. That wall wasn't just dividing a city, it was dividing the entire world. For 45 years, two superpowers pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to destroy civilization several times over. Every continent was a chessboard, every conflict a proxy war, every miscalculation a potential apocalypse. And on at least 3 occasions, the only thing standing between humanity and total annihilation was one person making the right call under impossible pressure. The Cold War wasn't just a rivalry between America and the Soviet Union. It was the story of how the whole world held its breath for half a century. Using AI trained on historical imagery, we can now take the original photographs, news footage, and archival images from this era and see them as living, breathing scenes. The faces, the fallout shelters, the missile silos, the protests that changed everything. This is the entire Cold War. 45 years, 25 minutes. Let's begin at the beginning. The year is 1945. The Second World War is over. Europe is rubble. And 60 million people are dead. And the two nations that did the most to win the war are now staring at each other across the wreckage, realizing they agree on almost nothing. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies of convenience. They shared an enemy in Hitler, not an ideology. America is capitalist, democratic, and has just detonated the most destructive weapon in human history over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union is communist, authoritarian, and has just lost 27 million of its own people, more than any other nation. Stalin is paranoid, exhausted, and absolutely determined that Russia will never be invaded again. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin carve up post-war Europe like men dividing a map with a knife. The lines they draw will define the world for the next half-century. Germany is split into 4 zones. Berlin, sitting deep inside the Soviet zone, is split too. East and West. It's supposed to be temporary. It won't be. By 1946, the wartime alliance is already falling apart. In March, Winston Churchill stands before an audience in Fulton, Missouri, and delivers a phrase that will define an era. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain, Stalin is installing communist governments across Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. One by one, and nations that fought to be free from Nazi occupation find themselves under Soviet control instead. Elections are rigged. Opposition leaders disappear. Secret police move in. The West watches with growing alarm. In 1947, President Truman announces a new doctrine. The United States will support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. It sounds noble. In practice, it means America will spend the next 4 decades funding, arming, and sometimes overthrowing governments on every continent to stop communism from spreading. That same year, the Marshall Plan pumps $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe. It's partly humanitarian, partly strategic. A prosperous Europe is a Europe that won't turn communist. Stalin responds by tightening his grip on the East. In June 1948, he makes his boldest move yet. He blockades West Berlin. Every road, every railway, every canal leading into the western sectors is shut down. 2.5 million people are cut off from food, fuel, and supplies. Stalin's calculation is simple. The West will abandon Berlin. They won't risk war over half a city. He's wrong. For 11 months, American and British planes fly round the clock, delivering everything a city needs to survive. A plane lands in West Berlin every 30 seconds at the peak. Coal, flour, medicine, even candy dropped on tiny parachutes for the children below. The Berlin airlift becomes the first great showdown of the Cold War, and the West wins it without firing a shot. Stalin lifts the blockade in May 1949, humiliated. But the real shock comes 4 months later. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons is over. The arms race has begun. The 1950s arrive, and the Cold War explodes out of Europe and into Asia. In June 1950, and North Korean forces pour across the 38th parallel and invade South Korea. Within days, the United Nations, led by the United States, sends troops to push them back. It should be a limited conflict. It becomes a nightmare. General Douglas MacArthur pushes the North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border. China warns him to stop. He doesn't stop. In November, 300,000 Chinese soldiers come flooding across the Yalu River in the dead of winter, and the UN forces are thrown back in one of the worst military reversals in American history. MacArthur wants to use nuclear weapons on China. Truman fires him instead. The war grinds on for 3 more years, killing over 2 million civilians. When the armistice is signed in 1953, the border is almost exactly where it started. Nothing has been gained. The Korean peninsula remains divided to this day. Meanwhile, the nuclear arms race is accelerating beyond anything anyone imagined. In 1952, the United States tests the first hydrogen bomb on a Pacific atoll. The explosion vaporizes an entire island. It's 500 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The Soviets test their own hydrogen bomb less than a year later. Both sides begin stockpiling weapons at a staggering rate. By the end of the decade, there are enough nuclear warheads to destroy every major city on Earth multiple times over. Military strategists develop a doctrine with a fitting acronym: MAD, a mutually assured destruction. The theory is simple and terrifying. Neither side will launch a first strike because doing so guarantees their own annihilation. Peace through the promise of extinction. This is the logic that keeps the world alive for the next 40 years. At home, the fear is becoming personal. American schoolchildren practice duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks as if a wooden desk could stop a nuclear fireball. Families build fallout shelters in their backyards. Senator Joseph McCarthy launches a crusade against suspected communists in Hollywood, government, and the military, destroying careers and lives based on accusation alone. The Red Scare grips America. Fear of the enemy outside becomes fear of the enemy within. Then, in 1957, the Soviets shock the world again. On October 4th, a small metal sphere called Sputnik begins orbiting the Earth, beeping a signal that every radio on the planet can hear. The message is unmistakable. If the Soviets can put a satellite in space, they can put a nuclear warhead on any city in America. The space race begins, and the Soviets keep winning it. First satellite, first animal in orbit, first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. In April 1961, grinning from inside a capsule as he circles the Earth. Every Soviet achievement is a propaganda triumph. Communism, it seems, is beating capitalism at the future itself. Kennedy responds with a promise that sounds almost reckless. Before this decade is out, America will land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. NASA gets virtually unlimited funding. The Apollo program becomes the most ambitious engineering project in human history. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface. 600 million people watch on television. It's the largest audience for any event in human history up to that point. The American flag stands on the moon. The space race is effectively over. But the Cold War is far from finished. Because while the world was looking up, things on the ground were getting worse. The early 1960s bring the Cold War to its most dangerous point. But first, the shadows. Because alongside the armies, the missiles, and the diplomats, another war is being fought entirely in the dark. The CIA and the KGB are running operations across the globe. Double agents, dead drops, honeypot traps, and assassination plots. In 1960, the Soviets shoot down an American U-2 spy plane deep inside their territory. The pilot, Gary Francis Powers, survives and is paraded before cameras in Moscow. Eisenhower is caught in a lie. He claimed it was a weather plane. The Soviets have the wreckage and the pilot to prove otherwise. A peace summit collapses. Trust, already fragile, shatters completely. A young president named John F. Kennedy takes office in January 1961, and within months, everything starts going wrong. In April, Kennedy approves a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba. 1,400 Cuban exiles land at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion is a catastrophe. Castro's forces crush it in 3 days. Kennedy is humiliated on the world stage, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev concludes that the new American president is weak. In August, Khrushchev makes his own bold move. Overnight, East German workers begin stringing barbed wire through the center of Berlin. Within days, it becomes a concrete wall. Families who went to sleep in one city wake up in two. People are separated from their jobs, their relatives, their entire lives. Over the next 28 years, at least 140 people will die trying to cross that wall. But the real crisis comes in October 1962. American spy planes photograph Soviet missile installations being built in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Nuclear missiles capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes. Kennedy has to respond. Kennedy has warned, no, but every option risks nuclear war. For 13 days, the world stands on the edge of annihilation. Kennedy orders a naval blockade around Cuba. Soviet ships carrying more missiles are steaming toward the island. If they don't turn back, the US Navy has orders to stop them by force. The Pentagon urges an airstrike. Some generals push for a full invasion. Curtis LeMay tells Kennedy that anything less is appeasement. On October 27th, the darkest day, and a Soviet submarine near Cuba loses contact with Moscow. The captain believes war has already started. He orders the launch of a nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. Launch requires the agreement of 3 officers. 2 say yes. The third, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, says no. He refuses to authorize the launch. One man, one decision. The world doesn't end. That same day, Kennedy and Khrushchev reach a secret deal. The Soviets will remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans will quietly remove their own missiles from Turkey and promise not to invade Cuba. Both sides step back from the edge. A direct phone line, the hotline, is installed between Washington and Moscow so that next time the two leaders can actually talk to each other before it's too late. The Cuban Missile Crisis is over. But the lesson is seared into the memory of everyone alive. we came that close. Vietnam is where the Cold War stops being abstract and becomes horrifyingly real on American television screens every single night. The logic seems straightforward to Washington. If Vietnam falls to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia follows like dominoes. So America sends advisors, then troops, then 500,000 soldiers into a jungle war against an enemy that doesn't fight like an army. The Viet Cong blend into villages. The North Vietnamese dig tunnels that stretch for miles. American firepower is overwhelming, but it doesn't matter. You can't bomb an ideology. By 1968, the war is tearing America apart. The Tet Offensive in January stuns the country. The North Vietnamese attack over 100 cities simultaneously. Militarily, they're beaten back. Psychologically, they've shattered the illusion that America is winning. Trusted newscaster Walter Cronkite tells the nation the war is unwinnable. And President Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election. Amid the protests explode. Students occupy campuses. Police beat demonstrators at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. In 1970, National Guard troops open fire on unarmed students at Kent State University. 4 are killed. The country is at war with itself. Nixon promises peace, but secretly expands the bombing into Cambodia and Laos. It takes until 1973 to negotiate a withdrawal. When Saigon finally falls in April 1975, the last Americans are evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. 58,000 Americans are dead, between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese. The dominoes don't fall, but the damage to bodies, to trust, to America's sense of itself is immense. The 1970s bring something unexpected, a thaw. Nixon, the lifelong anti-communist, does what no one expects. He goes to China. In February 1972, the American president shakes hands with Mao Zedong, driving a wedge between the two largest communist powers. It's pure strategy. If China and the Soviet Union distrust each other, these both are weaker. Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev sign arms control agreements. SALT I limits the number of ballistic missiles each side can build. Tensions ease, trade increases, it even has a name. Détente, the French word for relaxation. But détente has limits. The Soviets keep funding revolutionary movements in Africa and Latin America. The Americans keep propping up dictators who happen to be anti-communist. In Chile, the CIA helps overthrow the democratically elected Salvador Allende and installs Augusto Pinochet, a military dictator responsible for thousands of deaths and disappearances. In Angola, Cuban troops fight alongside Soviet-backed forces, while the CIA funds the opposition. In Central America, right-wing death squads receive American training and weapons. Across the global South, the Cold War is anything but cold. Millions of people who never asked to be part of this rivalry become its casualties. And then, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. 100,000 troops pour across the border to prop up a failing communist government. It's a catastrophic miscalculation. Afghan Mujahideen fighters, armed with American Stinger missiles and funded by CIA money funneled through Pakistan, turn the country into the Soviet Union's own Vietnam. Détente is dead. The 1980 Olympics in Moscow are boycotted by the West. The 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles are boycotted by the East. Uneven sports become a battlefield. Ronald Reagan takes office in 1981 with a simple message. The Soviet Union is the evil empire and America is going to win. He launches the biggest peacetime military buildup in history. Defense spending skyrockets. New missile systems are deployed in Western Europe, sparking massive protests. Hundreds of thousands march through London, Bonn, Rome, and Amsterdam, terrified that their cities are now nuclear targets. And Reagan proposes the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system that critics call Star Wars. Scientists say it won't work. That almost doesn't matter. The Soviets have to assume it might, and matching American spending is breaking their economy. In September 1983, the world nearly ends again, and almost nobody knows it at the time. A Soviet early warning satellite reports 5 American nuclear missiles headed for Russia. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, has minutes to decide whether to report an incoming strike, which would trigger a full Soviet nuclear retaliation. He looks at the data. Something feels wrong. 5 missiles is too few for a first strike. He calls it a false alarm. He's right. A software glitch had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. One man's gut instinct saves the world. Again. Because beneath the surface, the Soviet system is rotting. The economy hasn't truly grown in a decade. Consumer goods are scarce. Lines for bread stretch around city blocks. The technology gap with the West is widening every year. The war in Afghanistan is draining lives and money, and the leadership is literally dying. Brezhnev dies in 1982. His successor Andropov dies in 1984. Andropov's successor Chernenko dies in 1985. 3 funerals in 3 years. The system is geriatric, exhausted, running on inertia. Then in 1985, someone different takes power. Mikhail Gorbachev is 54 years old, in a system run by men in their 70s. He's energetic, charismatic, and he understands something his predecessors refused to accept. The Soviet Union cannot continue as it is. He introduces 2 ideas that will change everything: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wants to reform communism, not destroy it. Allow criticism. Introduce some market economics. Pull the troops out of Afghanistan. Most dangerously for the old guard, he allows people to speak the truth about their own government for the first time in decades. The problem with opening a pressure valve on 70 years of repression is that you can't control what comes out. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor in Ukraine explodes, spreading radiation across Europe. The Soviet government's first instinct is to cover it up. Under glasnost, the truth comes out anyway, and it's devastating. Not just the disaster itself, but the realization that the system lied. About everything. Gorbachev meets Reagan in Reykjavik in 1986. They come breathtakingly close to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons. The deal falls apart over Star Wars. But the 2 leaders have established something unprecedented between an American president and a Soviet premier. Trust. By 1989, the walls are cracking. Not just in Berlin, everywhere. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union movement forces free elections. A non-communist government takes power for the first time in 4 decades. Hungary opens its border with Austria, and East Germans start flooding through. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution topples the communist government without a shot fired. Romania is bloodier. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu is overthrown and executed on Christmas Day. And then Berlin, November 9th, 1989. An East German spokesman, stumbling through a press conference, accidentally announces that the border is open, effective immediately. Thousands of East Berliners rush to the wall. The guards, overwhelmed and confused, with no orders to shoot, step aside. People climb the wall. They dance on it. They take sledgehammers to it. strangers embrace, families separated for 28 years find each other in the floodlit chaos. It's one of the most extraordinary nights in human history. And it happens not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic mistake and a crowd that simply decides they've had enough. And Gorbachev lets it happen. He could send tanks, the way Moscow crushed Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. He doesn't. That single decision, the decision not to act, may be the most consequential act of courage in the entire Cold War. Germany reunifies in October 1990. The Soviet satellite states are gone, and now the Soviet Union itself begins to unravel. The Baltic states declare independence. Ukraine moves towards sovereignty. Hardliners attempt a coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, rolling tanks into Moscow. Boris Yeltsin stands on a tank and rallies the opposition. The coup collapses in 3 days. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as president of a country that no longer exists. The Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor takes its place. The Cold War is over. 45 years. 2 superpowers. Enough nuclear weapons to end civilization dozens of times over. Proxy wars on every continent. Millions dead in Korea and Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Central America, and a dozen other countries that became battlefields for someone else's ideology. And yet, the bombs never fell. The missiles stayed in their silos. Not because systems worked perfectly, but because at critical moments, individual human beings chose not to push the button. Arkhipov on a submarine near Cuba, Petrov in a bunker outside Moscow, Kennedy choosing the blockade over the airstrike, and Gorbachev choosing to let the wall fall instead of sending tanks. The Cold War could have ended civilization. It didn't. And the margin was thinner than most people will ever know. The Cold War shaped the world we live in today. NATO still exists. Nuclear weapons still exist. The borders drawn in the aftermath of 1945 are still contested. The suspicion between East and West never fully disappeared. It just went quiet for a while. Visit Checkpoint Charlie today, and you'll see tourists snapping selfies where soldiers once stood with rifles. The wall is mostly gone. Fragments sit in museums around the world. But if you know where to look in Berlin, you can still find the line where it stood, cutting through streets and neighborhoods and lives. A scar that healed, but never completely. Thanks for watching. Creating videos like this takes an enormous amount of research and time. Piecing together 45 years of global conflict into a single story is a challenge, but it's one I love taking on. If you enjoyed this journey through the Cold War, from the rubble of 1945 to the fall of the Soviet Union, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And let me know in the comments, what era or conflict would you like to see next? As always, we'll see you in the past.